The Wolf King anticipated a greeting, but the quiet girl bowed according to old ways. The morning sun had not yet risen over the kingdom of Urindor, but the air was already heavy with anticipation. Mist clung to the cobblestones like a soft gray blanket, hiding the early stirrings of life in the quiet streets. In the distance, the great castle of the Wolf King rose from the cliffs, its spires reaching into the sky like the teeth of some sleeping giant. Legends whispered that the castle had been built on sacred ground, where wolves once roamed freely and kings drew their power from the forest's shadows. Lyra walked through the streets, her steps careful and measured. She was not a common village girl, yet neither was she accustomed to the grandeur of the castle. Her cloak was simple, her hair tied back neatly, but her eyes held a quiet sharpness, as if they were seeing things others overlooked. She was a girl of old ways, taught by her grandmother to bow with respect, not fear, to speak softly, but when words were needed, to speak with truth. Today she was to enter the great hall for the first time, for the festival honoring the Wolf King, a festival that had not welcomed outsiders in generations. Inside the castle, the atmosphere was different. Servants moved quickly, arranging tapestries and golden lanterns. Courtiers whispered behind silken fans, their eyes darting like nervous birds at every shadow. The Wolf King, Kale, was already in his hall, seated on his throne. His presence was commanding, yet quiet, like a storm restrained. Dark hair fell over his sharp shoulders, and his eyes, gray as winter ice, scanned the hall with the precision of a predator. He had ruled Urindor for 20 years, feared by some, respected by all, and always alone. Kale anticipated the approach of his subjects. Every hand raised in the customary bow, every voice lowered in reverence, would remind him of the power he held and the solitude that came with it. But today his attention was drawn to a single figure moving through the misted hallways, a quiet girl with a steady gaze and a slow, deliberate step. Lyra entered the hall. Her heart beat steadily, though her palms were damp. She had heard the stories of Kale's temper, his unyielding rule, but she did not come as a subject seeking favor. She came as a visitor, guided by her family's duty and by her own quiet courage. The courtiers gasped when they saw her. Not because of her beauty, which was simple and unassuming, but because she walked as if the hall belonged to her as much as it did to anyone else. When Lyra reached the center of the hall, she paused. All eyes turned to her. The Wolf King watched, his face unreadable, his mind calculating. She was expected to perform the customary bow, kneeling slightly, lowering her gaze in complete submission. That was what every visitor did. That was what every subject knew. But Lyra had learned the old ways, passed down from her grandmother. She did not bow out of fear. She bowed out of respect, bending her body slowly, her hands resting lightly on her knees, her head lowered just enough to honor the king without losing her own dignity. It was a gesture forgotten in the palace, seen only in the villages that still remembered the old customs. The hall went silent. Courtiers murmured, their whispers slicing through the still air like the hiss of a snake. Some gasped, others looked uneasy. Kale's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in curiosity. He had seen many before her, all bowing in the same way, all kneeling so completely that their individuality vanished in the act of submission. But she bowed differently. She was not afraid. She was deliberate. She was different. Kale leaned forward slightly, his gray eyes fixed on her. He did not speak. There was no welcome, no harsh command. He simply watched, letting the silence stretch like a drawn bowstring. Lyra held her posture steady as a mountain, aware of every eye in the hall but caring for none of them. Her heart was steady, yet inside, a storm of nerves whispered at her. She did not flinch under his gaze. She did not falter. She remained herself, calm, small, and strong. The courtiers whispered again, this time in more urgent tones. One man, tall and narrow, stepped forward cautiously. "Your Majesty, she does not bow as we expect." His voice trembled slightly, betraying both fear and disbelief. Kale's hand rested lightly on the arm of his throne, but he did not respond immediately. He studied Lyra. He saw her family's mark, faint on the edge of her cloak, and the memories it stirred were like embers in his chest. A pendant around her neck caught the morning light, simple but with an old symbol, a symbol Kale had not seen for decades. A symbol of the lost queen, of a lineage that had vanished from his kingdom but had never been forgotten by the wolves that guarded his halls. "Old ways," Kale murmured, his voice low and smooth, almost like a shadow moving across the floor. "You bow according to the old ways." Lyra lifted her gaze slightly, just enough to meet his eyes, though she did not straighten completely. "I bow with respect," she said softly, her voice calm but certain. "I bow as my grandmother taught me. I bow for what is right, not for fear." The hall fell even more silent, if that were possible. Every whisper stopped. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. The Wolf King, who rarely allowed surprise to touch his face, felt a strange twist in his chest. He could not name it, curiosity, intrigue, or the faintest touch of admiration, but it was unlike anything he had felt in years. A sudden movement in the shadows of the hall drew his attention. One of his advisors, older and bent, approached him quietly. "Kale," the man whispered, "she is not like the others, be careful. The stories, there are things about her bloodline, things we do not fully understand." Kale's eyes returned to Lyra, but this time they were sharper, more intense. "I have seen many warnings," he said softly, "and I have ignored most. But you are different. I will see what this means myself." Lyra, unaware of the warning, simply stood, her posture calm, as if she had been expecting this. There was a strange rhythm to her movements, a quiet confidence that unsettled the court and intrigued the king. She was small, fragile in appearance, yet every step she took seemed deliberate, like the beat of a drum in an ancient song. For a moment, the Wolf King allowed himself to imagine her in the quiet of the forest, among wolves, under the silver moonlight. There was something in her, something that belonged not to the palace but to the wild, to the shadows that whispered of old magic and forgotten bloodlines. "Follow me," he said finally, his voice cutting through the silence, not as a command but as an invitation. Lyra nodded once, a small, respectful gesture, and fell in step behind him. The courtiers watched in awe, some leaning closer to murmur, "The king himself invites her." Others shook their heads, uncertain whether it was honor or danger that had brought her this far. They walked through the castle corridors, the walls lined with banners and tapestries depicting the history of the Wolf Kings. Some showed battles, some showed kings kneeling to mysterious figures in the forest, and some showed wolves with eyes as bright as silver flames. Lyra's gaze moved over them quietly, drinking in the stories they told without speaking a word. At last, they arrived at a balcony overlooking the kingdom. Mist curled like living smoke over the cliffs below, and the forest stretched endlessly into the horizon. The castle's wolves were gathered below, silent and watchful, their eyes reflecting the rising sun. Kale stood beside her, silent, his hand brushing briefly against the hilt of his sword. "Do you see them?" he asked, his voice low. "They watch over the kingdom as I do. They are not servants, not pets, but guardians, and they sense what you are, even if I do not fully understand it yet." Lyra looked down at the wolves. Her heart stirred as if she had felt this moment all her life. She bent slightly, bowing her head once more, not to the king, but to the creatures beneath the balcony. The wolves' ears twitched, and one silver-eyed wolf stepped forward, bowing its head in return. Kale's gray eyes widened imperceptibly. No one in generations had bowed to the wolves and received such acknowledgement. His heart beat a little faster, though he did not admit it. The quiet girl had done what no other visitor could. She had connected with something older, something wild, something dangerous yet beautiful. "Very well," Kale said finally, straightening. His voice carried across the balcony, strong and steady. "You have passed the first test, Lyra of the old ways, But the kingdom and I will test you further. Be ready." Lyra met his gaze. "I am ready," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. For a moment they stood in silence, the wind lifting their hair, the mist curling like ghostly dancers around their feet, and the distant howls of wolves echoing in the valleys below. Then, from the shadows of the castle, a figure watched them, silent and foreboding. One hand rested lightly on a dagger, the other on a scroll marked with warnings of bloodlines and curses long forgotten. "She is here," the figure whispered, "and she may awaken what should remain buried." Kale's gaze sharpened. "Then let it awaken," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. A storm was coming to Erendor, and for the first time in decades, the Wolf King felt a flicker of excitement and fear that the future might not be entirely his to command. Lyra, unaware of the silent watcher, lifted her head and looked out over the kingdom. She felt a strange connection to the land, to the shadows, and to the creatures that roamed freely beneath the silver sun. She was small, she was quiet, but she was not powerless. And the Wolf King, who had commanded fear for 20 years, realized that he had never faced anything like her before. The hall had been silent before, but the echoes of what had just happened would ripple far beyond its stone walls. The quiet girl had bowed according to the old ways, but in doing so she had set into motion events that no one, neither king, court, nor commoner, could yet predict. The mist of the morning curled higher, the wolves' howls grew louder, and the sun finally crested the horizon. A new day had begun in Erendor, one that promised change, danger, and a power neither Kale nor Lyra fully understood. The evening settled over Erendor like a velvet cloak, soft and heavy. Mist crept through the valleys and the edges of the forest, curling around the ancient trees like quiet spirits. The castle loomed above the land, its walls glowing faintly with torchlight. Inside, the corridors were quieter now, the courtiers having retreated to their chambers, leaving only the shadows and the occasional flicker of a servant's lantern. Kale, the Wolf King, walked beside Lyra as they moved through the castle halls. His steps were long and silent, his dark cloak brushing the floor like a shadow moving on its own. Lyra followed closely, her hands folded lightly in front of her. She felt the weight of the hall, of the history around her, but she did not shrink. She moved as if she belonged, though every instinct told her she was stepping into something far greater than herself. "Why have you brought me here?" Lyra asked softly, her voice careful. She did not want to speak too loudly, yet she could not help but ask. Kale's gray eyes, sharp and piercing, glanced at her for a brief moment. "To see," he said simply, "to understand. You move differently than others, you bow differently, you do not fear as others fear. I want to see what that means." Lyra looked down, then back at him. "I do not fear because I know fear does not serve me," she said. "Only respect, only understanding, only truth." Kale allowed a faint smile, almost imperceptible, to curve his lips. Few had spoken to him in that manner and lived to see another day, yet Lyra's calm voice did not tremble and it did not seek to please. She spoke from a place older than the court, older than the castle. "Then follow me," he said. "There is a place I want you to see. A place not all of my people are allowed." The hallways led them to a balcony overlooking the forest. Moonlight spilled across the trees, silvering the leaves and turning the mist into a soft, rolling ocean. The wolves were there, gathered silently, watching. Their eyes reflected the moonlight, bright and sharp. Some stepped forward as Kale approached, bowing their heads slightly. Lyra's heart stirred, for she recognized something in them, something ancient and familiar. "You see them," Kale said. "They are my guardians, my family, my curse, and my gift. They follow me because they must, but they recognize truth where others do not, and they sense you already." Lyra's hand instinctively went to her chest. The pendant she wore glinted in the moonlight. Its symbol, faint but familiar to Kale, seemed to pulse slightly as she looked at the wolves. She felt a strange calm, as if she were standing among old friends she had never met. "They trust me," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kale studied her. It is not trust yet, he said slowly. It is recognition. Something in you, something I cannot name. They sense it and I feel it too. It is dangerous and yet it draws me in. Lyra nodded, not fully understanding but feeling the weight of his words. She had always known her family carried old knowledge, old ways, old respect for the creatures of the forest and the spirits of the land. Perhaps it was that knowledge, passed down in whispers and lessons, that called to the wolves and the king alike. Kale motioned for her to follow him into the forest. Come, he said. If you are ready, I will show you what it truly means to be here, under the moon with the old ways. The forest embraced them in shadow and silver light. The trees were tall and silent, their leaves rustling only when the wind passed through. Lyra's eyes took in everything, the moss on the stones, the shapes of the trees, the glimmer of the moon on the streams that ran through the forest. She felt as though she were stepping into a memory not her own, into a place both alive and still. A low howl echoed through the trees, soft at first, then rising in a long, mournful note. The wolves appeared, silent and graceful, emerging from the shadows as if the forest itself were giving them shape. Their eyes were bright, intelligent, and full of something older than time. Lyra froze for a moment, bowing her head instinctively. One wolf, larger than the rest and silver-eyed, stepped forward and lowered itself slightly, as if acknowledging her presence. Kale's gaze was fixed on her. "Do you see?" he asked. "You bowed as they bow, you honor them. You do not seek to command, you seek to understand. And in doing so, you awaken something I have not seen in decades." Lyra felt a thrill, a quiet power rising in her chest. She did not know what she had awakened, but she felt connected to the land, to the wolves, to the shadows that danced under the moonlight. She realized that she was no ordinary girl, though she had never known her full potential. Kale stepped closer, his presence strong and silent, and placed his hand lightly on the hilt of his sword, not in threat, but as if he too were anchoring himself to the moment. "You may not understand yet," he said, his voice low, "but you have entered a world that few live to see. The old ways are dangerous, and so are those who remember them." Lyra lifted her head. "I am not afraid," she said, though her voice was calm. She did not shout, she did not plead. She stated it simply, as one might state the color of the sky or the passing of the seasons. Kale studied her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Not afraid, yet there is fire in you. You may walk the path willingly, but the path is not forgiving. It will test you, challenge you, and try to take all that you hold dear. Are you ready for that?" Lyra nodded. "I have no choice but to be ready," she replied. "And I will face whatever comes, as my grandmother taught me, with calm, with respect, with truth." A wolf stepped forward, brushing past her legs as if to seal the unspoken bond. Its silver eyes met hers, and for a moment she felt the forest's heartbeat, the pulse of life older than any castle or crown. Kale's lips pressed into a thin line. He rarely allowed emotion to surface in his voice, but there was a flicker of something, interest, perhaps, or wonder. "We begin then," he said. "You will learn the ways of the forest, the ways of the wolves, and the ways that few dare to remember. You may not understand everything at first, but patience will teach you more than fear ever could." The two walked deeper into the forest, the mist curling around their ankles, the shadows of the trees stretching long and silver in the moonlight. Kale told her stories of the old kings, of curses that had haunted his family for centuries, of wolves that had been both his guardians and his teachers. Lyra listened quietly, absorbing every word, feeling a strange connection to the history that seemed almost alive beneath the leaves. Hours passed, though it felt like moments. They came to a small clearing where the moonlight fell in a perfect circle, illuminating a stone altar covered with ancient runes. Kale knelt, tracing the symbols with his fingers as if speaking to the past through touch. "You see this?" he asked. "This is where the Wolf King spoke with the forest, with the spirits, with the wolves. Few are allowed here, fewer still understand. And now you are here. You have the choice to step fully into this or to turn back. Lyra looked at the altar, at the glowing runes, at the silver eyes of the wolves that circled the clearing. She felt a stirring deep in her soul, something calling her forward. She knelt slowly, placing her hands lightly on the stone, feeling its cold surface, feeling the whispers of those who had come before her. Kale watched her silently. He could feel the shift, subtle but undeniable. The forest was acknowledging her presence, and so was he. A bond, unspoken and ancient, was forming. And in that moment he realized that this quiet girl, the one who had bowed according to the old ways, was more than she appeared. She held the key to truths long buried, to power long forgotten, and perhaps to the redemption he had long sought for his own cursed soul. A rustle in the trees made them both turn. Shadows moved quickly, barely visible among the mist and moonlight. Kale's hand went to the hilt of his sword, but Lyra remained calm. She lifted her hand slightly, palm outward, as if acknowledging the forest itself. The shadows receded, and a faint whisper, like the rustle of leaves in an ancient language, reached her ears. She did not understand the words, but she understood the meaning. You are seen. You are known. You are part of this now. Kale's eyes met hers. You have begun something that cannot be undone, he said quietly. And yet I cannot turn away. The forest, the wolves, and now you have drawn me into a story I cannot escape. Lyra smiled faintly. Nor would I ask you to, she said. If we are meant to walk this path together, then we must trust, even when the way is unclear. The moon rose higher, casting silver light across the clearing, the wolves, and the two figures standing at its center. In that light, Kale saw not just a girl, but a force of calm, quiet strength. In that same light, Lyra saw not just a king, but a man shaped by shadows, yet capable of change. The wind stirred, carrying the distant howls of the pack. And somewhere in the depths of the forest, an unseen presence stirred as well, watching, waiting, sensing the awakening of something that had long been dormant. Kale knew the night was only beginning, and that this quiet girl had changed the course of more than one destiny. The castle of Urindor was quiet now, but not for long. The corridors that had once seemed vast and empty now carried whispers. Courtiers moved like shadows, their eyes darting, their voices low, carrying secrets that were meant to unsettle. Even the servants felt the tension, though they did not know its source. The Wolf King, Kale, had been restless since the night in the forest. The quiet girl, Lyra, had awakened something within him, and he sensed it would not end easily. Lyra sat in the small chamber Kale had given her near the hall, her hands folded in her lap. The room was modest but warm, with a small fire flickering in the hearth. She thought of the forest, of the wolves, of the silver moonlight that had crowned her with a sense of belonging she had never known before. And she thought of Kale, the Wolf King, whose presence was at once powerful, commanding, and quietly vulnerable when it came to her. There was a knock at the door. Lyra rose carefully and opened it to see a young servant girl standing there. She bowed quickly. "Your Majesty, Lyra, I bring word from the court," she whispered, her eyes wide. Lyra took the message, reading it silently. The festival had ended, but the court was far from settled. A rival noble, Lord Malric, had begun to whisper that Lyra's arrival was not an honor, but a threat, that her connection to the old ways and her strange bond with Kale might upset the balance of power. Lyra folded the letter and felt a twinge of worry, but she did not let it show. She knew she must remain calm, for fear would give the court more power than she could ever wield. And she also knew that Kale would notice any faltering, any sign that she might be weak. The next morning, Kale summoned her to the great hall once more. The hall was filled with courtiers and nobles, but Lyra's eyes were drawn immediately to Kale. He sat upon his throne, his presence more commanding than ever, his gaze scanning her as though she were both question and answer. "Lyra," Kale said, his voice clear and strong, You have learned the first lesson, but the second will test your courage. The court is a different forest, filled with shadows that do not howl openly. You must move carefully, speak carefully, and watch carefully. Do you understand? I understand, Lyra replied softly. Her voice did not tremble and her posture remained steady. Cale inclined his head slightly. Then let us begin. The court watched with curiosity and unease. Lyra's calm demeanor unsettled many, especially Lord Malric, who whispered to his allies in the shadows. She knows nothing of our ways, he hissed, yet she moves as if she commands. The king's attention is dangerous, and she is dangerous too. Lyra did not hear him, but Cale did. He felt the shift in the room, the currents of jealousy, fear, and suspicion that had always accompanied power. And he also felt something else, the quiet certainty that Lyra was not ordinary. She carried strength in silence, and the old ways she practiced were more powerful than any sword. He led her to the center of the hall. "Observe," he said softly, "then act only when necessary. The court will test you, and so will I." The nobles circled her with their eyes, some curious, some skeptical, some openly hostile. Malric stepped forward, his tone sharp and deliberate. "You bowed to the king yesterday in a manner unusual. Do you think the old ways matter here, girl? Do you think respect alone will protect you?" Lyra met his gaze calmly. "Respect is always the path to understanding," she replied. "Power alone does not hold the truth." A murmur ran through the court. Cale's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing. He allowed her to speak, to move, to respond. He watched the subtle reactions of the nobles, learning their intentions, their fears, and their desires. Suddenly, a commotion rose at the edge of the hall. A page had rushed in, pale-faced, whispering to Cale. The Wolf King's expression darkened. "What is it?" he demanded. "There is a disturbance in the eastern wing, your majesty," the page said, trembling. "A fire has started near the library. Some say it is an accident, others, it may be intentional." Cale rose swiftly, his presence commanding silence. "Lead the way," he said, motioning for Lyra to follow. The two moved quickly through the castle corridors. Smoke began to curl under doors and around corners. The smell of burning wood filled the air. Courtiers and servants fled, their eyes wide with fear. Cale's wolves had already appeared, moving with silent grace, guiding people to safety and assessing the danger. Lyra stayed close to Cale, her mind sharp. She remembered the old ways her grandmother had taught her, how to read signs, how to sense danger, how to move without causing panic. The fire was small for now, but it could grow quickly if not controlled. She pointed to a loose tapestry near the flames. "If we remove this, it will not spread so quickly," she said. Cale nodded. "Good." He moved swiftly, pulling the tapestry down while Lyra helped steady it. Together, they prevented the flames from spreading further. Once the fire was under control, Cale turned to her, his gray eyes intense. "You acted wisely," he said. "Few would have noticed so quickly. Few would have acted without fear." Lyra nodded, feeling a quiet pride. "I learned from the old ways. Fear only blinds. Calmness and understanding protect more than strength alone." Cale studied her for a long moment. "You are unlike anyone I have known," he said. "And yet, you belong here, perhaps more than you know." Their moment of quiet was broken by Lord Malric, who stepped forward with a sharp sneer. "A girl in the castle now dares to command the king's attention. This is unacceptable. I will not allow her influence to grow unchecked." Cale's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer to Lyra, a protective shadow. "Influence is earned, not given," he said, his voice cold and steady. "And it seems she has earned more than you have, Malric." Malric's face flushed with anger, but he stepped back, realizing that Cale's presence left him little room to act. The court murmured again, tension rising like a storm ready to break. Later that night, Cale led Lyra to a private balcony overlooking the forest. The castle was quiet, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the distant howls of the wolves. "You handled yourself well today," Cale said, his voice softer now. carrying a rare warmth. But the court is only the beginning. There are forces in this kingdom, hidden and old, that will test you far beyond the palace walls. Lyra looked out at the forest, feeling the weight of his words. "I am ready," she said quietly. "If the path is difficult, I will walk it. If danger comes, I will meet it. I will not falter." Kale studied her, seeing the truth in her eyes. For decades he had trusted few. For decades he had carried the weight of the crown and the curse upon his bloodline alone. Yet with Lyra he felt something new. Not fear, not doubt, but a fragile trust forming like a small flame in the darkness. Suddenly, a movement in the trees caught their attention. A shadow shifted, and a faint whisper of magic passed through the night air. Lyra stiffened, recognizing the presence of something ancient, something alive in the forest that was older than any king. Kale's hand went to the hilt of his sword. "Do not move," he whispered. The wolves below circled silently, their eyes bright and alert. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall and cloaked, face hidden, moving with a grace that was almost unnatural. The figure stopped at the edge of the clearing, watching them, waiting. Lyra felt a strange pull, a recognition she could not explain. The figure carried the air of the old ways, of secrets kept long and carefully hidden. She realized that their journey, their bond, and the awakening of ancient forces were only beginning. Kale did not speak. He simply watched, his gray eyes narrowing as he assessed the figure. He could feel the tension in the air, the balance of power shifting subtly. The forest, the wolves, and now this shadow, all were part of a story that had been set in motion long before either he or Lyra had arrived. The figure spoke, its voice low and melodic, carrying on the wind. "The girl walks among the old ways, and the king walks with her. Do you know what you awaken?" Kale's gaze hardened. "We will face it," he said. "Whatever it is, we will face it together." Lyra nodded, feeling the weight of destiny pressing lightly against her chest. She did not yet understand all the forces at play, but she felt the truth of the forest, of the wolves, and of Kale himself. They were bound together now by fate, by courage, and by the awakening of something far older than the walls of the castle. The shadow moved back into the forest, disappearing as silently as it had come, but the air remained thick with anticipation. Lyra and Kale stood together, the moonlight casting silver across their faces, knowing that the peace of the night was only temporary. Forces were stirring, ancient and powerful, and their connection would be tested in ways neither could yet imagine. Kale finally spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You have changed everything, Lyra. The court, the forest, the kingdom. Even I am not certain of what comes next." Lyra looked at him, calm but resolute. "Then we face it together," she said, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had first caught his attention. And beneath the silver moonlight the wolves howled, as if in agreement, their voices echoing across the forest, carrying a warning, a promise, and a beginning. The night was thick with mist, curling through the trees like silver smoke. The castle of Erendor slept uneasily, its walls quiet but alive with shadows that moved as if they had purpose. Somewhere in the distance, the wolves howled, long and mournful, echoing across the valleys. Kale the Wolf King stood at the edge of the forest, his cloak brushing the wet leaves. Beside him, Lyra's calm presence anchored him, steady as a stone, her eyes reflecting the moonlight like twin lanterns. "The time has come," Kale said, his voice low and steady. "The forest has spoken, the wolves have spoken, and the kingdom itself whispers that something must end tonight." Lyra nodded, her hands lightly resting on the pendant around her neck. The symbol glowed faintly in the silver light. She had not understood its full meaning before, but now she felt its power, its connection to the Wolf King, to the old ways, and to the shadows that had followed them from the forest to the castle. "The ritual?" she asked softly. Kale's gray eyes were sharp. "Not just a ritual," he said. "It is a trial, it is a choice. We face the curse that has haunted my bloodline for generations. It is bound to the forest, to the wolves, and to me. But tonight it will be broken, or it will consume us both. The clearing before them was bathed in moonlight, silver, and cold. Stones marked with ancient runes circled the space, forming a sacred ring. The wolves waited at the edges, silent, their eyes bright and watchful. Lyra could feel the magic in the air, subtle and strong, twisting around them like a living thing. Cale drew a deep breath. "Stay close," he said. "Trust what you feel. The old ways are your guide, and your calm will carry us further than any sword could." Lyra stepped forward, her bare feet brushing the dew-soaked grass. She knelt in the center of the circle, lowering her head in the old manner. She felt the pulse of the land beneath her, the heartbeat of the forest, the whisper of the wolves in the shadows. She felt connected to everything: the king, the curse, the forest, and the destiny that had chosen her as its witness. Cale moved to stand beside her, his hand hovering near the hilt of his sword, though he did not touch it. The curse had been with him for decades, a darkness that grew heavier with each passing year, a shadow over his heart and his throne. He had faced many dangers, but nothing as old, as powerful, or as silent as this. Lyra raised her hand slowly, tracing a pattern over the runes on the stones. She felt their energy, ancient and knowing. She spoke softly, in the language her grandmother had taught her, words of calm, words of truth, words that honored the forest and the old ways. The runes began to glow faintly, the silver light spreading like the rising mist. The wolves stepped closer, circling around them, their eyes fixed on Lyra. One by one they lowered their heads, as if acknowledging her as part of the circle, part of the old power. Cale watched, amazed. No one in his life had commanded such presence. Not knights, not nobles, not even the most loyal of his advisors. She was small, quiet, and yet the forest itself responded to her. A sudden gust of wind blew through the clearing, carrying whispers of the past. Shadows stretched longer, twisting unnaturally across the stones. The air felt heavy, charged with magic. Cale felt the familiar tug of the curse, the weight of his ancestors, the dark energy that had clung to him for so long. "You must speak it," Cale said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Say the words." "The curse listens, and it will not release until it hears acknowledgement and truth." Lyra nodded, closing her eyes. She repeated the words slowly, deliberately, her voice carrying across the clearing. She spoke not from fear, but from understanding, from respect, from knowledge passed down through generations. The stones began to hum softly, a sound almost like a heartbeat, and the mist around them rose higher, forming shapes that shimmered and danced. Cale felt the air shift. The curse itself was present now, a cold, invisible weight pressing against him, testing his strength and resolve. He felt anger, fear, and loneliness rise as it always did, but Lyra's calm presence beside him anchored him. For the first time, he did not feel alone. "Step forward," Lyra said softly. "Face it. You must let it see you, not as a king, not as a ruler, but as a man who seeks redemption." Cale drew a deep breath and stepped into the center of the circle. He lowered his head in the same manner as Lyra, placing his hands on the stones. The runes flared brighter, silver and blue light intertwining. The wolves circled closer, forming a protective barrier, growling softly but without threat. The air thickened, and a low hum resonated through the clearing. Shadows stretched and moved like living things, pressing closer, testing the boundaries of the circle. Cale felt the curse reaching for him, probing his heart, his mind, his soul. He thought of the mistakes, the anger, the years of isolation. And then he felt Lyra's hand lightly brush his arm, steady, calm, reminding him that he did not face this alone. Together they spoke the final words, their voices overlapping, harmonious, strong yet gentle. The light flared, blinding in its brilliance, and for a moment the forest itself seemed to hold its breath. Then silence. The shadows withdrew, the mist fell, and the forest seemed still. The wolves sat quietly, their eyes bright, their heads lowered in reverence. Cale opened his eyes slowly, feeling a lightness he had not known in decades. The curse was broken. The weight he had carried alone was lifted, replaced not with emptiness but with a new sense of possibility. Lyra rose gracefully, looking at him with calm strength. "It is done," she said softly. "The old ways have guided us. The curse has ended." Cale felt a surge of gratitude, but also something more. A connection deeper than loyalty or respect, something quiet yet unshakable. "I owe you more than I can say," he said, his voice low, almost vulnerable. "You saved me and perhaps this kingdom as well." Lyra shook her head slightly. "We did it together," she said. "You trusted the old ways, you faced yourself. And I only followed what I have always known. Calmness, respect, truth, these are stronger than fear or anger." The wolves howled, a long, rising song that echoed across the valleys and cliffs. Cale felt their energy, their recognition, their approval. And he knew that Lyra was not just a visitor in the kingdom. She was part of its future, part of its strength, part of its heart. As dawn began to break, painting the mist with shades of pink and silver, Cale and Lyra walked back toward the castle. The kingdom was waking, the courtiers beginning to stir, unaware of the ancient forces that had been set right in the forest. But Cale and Lyra knew, and that knowledge bound them together. In the days that followed, the court began to see the change. Cale was no longer the distant, brooding king. There was lightness in his steps, clarity in his decisions, and a new warmth in his eyes. And Lyra, though still quiet and observant, became a presence that could not be ignored. Her calm strength guided more than the forest. It guided the people, the decisions, and the new path of the kingdom. Yet even with the curse broken, the memory of shadows lingered. Somewhere in the depths of the forest, something watched, silent and patient. Ancient magic does not vanish completely, and the echoes of what had been awakened would ripple through Erendor in ways that even Cale could not yet predict. One evening, as they stood together on the balcony overlooking the kingdom, Cale placed a hand lightly on Lyra's shoulder. "You changed everything," he said softly. "The kingdom, my life, even the forest itself seems different because of you." Lyra smiled faintly, her calm eyes meeting his. "And you changed too," she said. "You faced yourself, your fears, your past. You listened not just to the forest, but to yourself. That is how change begins." Cale's gray eyes softened. "Then we walk forward together," he said. "Whatever comes next, we face it side by side." Lyra nodded, feeling the weight of destiny, but also its promise. She had faced the court, the forest, the wolves, and the curse itself. And now she knew that no matter the challenges ahead, calm, respect, and truth would guide them. The wolves howled once more, and for a moment the sound seemed to carry a blessing, a promise that the kingdom was safe, the curse was gone, and a new chapter had begun. Cale looked at Lyra and realized that the quiet girl, who had bowed according to the old ways, had not only changed him, but had changed the kingdom forever. And beneath the rising sun, the mist curling like silver smoke through the forest, they both knew. Their story was only beginning, but for the first time it would be written not in fear or shadows, but in trust, strength, and the quiet power of the old ways.